Hey guys, Merry Christmas and goodwill to all people. Uh, let's start by giving out those sweet, sweet pine points. So, who do we have here? We have Greyback, Kali, and of course, Roman, who, as I was informed, had to actually surrender his LOL game. So, that's a massive sacrifice, obviously. But I'm afraid you only get 220 pine points, but you are still on the lead with 3,000 pine points. Congratulations, you are almost there. And for recently subscribed people, this is, of course, the great competition. 1 million pine points are going to give you a week in Las Vegas in a luxurious Tropicana spot with Pine Creek all expenses covered. And I'll actually be there myself. Um, so you will get to party not only with the dog, but also with me. So that's amazing, right? So today we are going to be talking about, of course, nativity, because what else, given the season? And you know what? We could do the usual stuff, like go over the contradictions and the historical inconsistencies. We could talk about uh, Christmas being pagan, about Sol Invictus and Mithra and these kinds of things. But I actually decided to do something a little bit different today, not focus that much on contradictions, but let's say on a different issue, which I think is like the real issue with the nativity, right? Hence the name of the stream. And one of the reasons why I don't want to focus on contradictions is because you can actually harmonize any contradiction. And I'm now officially issuing a challenge to any theist of any religion. Give me an apparent contradiction, of course, in a religion different than your own, right? Because if you're willing to buy the bullet on contradiction in your own worldview, that's not going to be very interesting. But if you think that a different religious system entails contradictions, give me an example and I'll show you how to harmonize it. And I claim that I will be able to do it 100% of the time, just with the same methodology that Christian apologists are using. So I will just use one of the harmonization methods that, for example, Lydia McGrew uses. And I think they can actually cover all the bases. They work every single time in every religion, no matter what you believe. It works so well, you'll be tired of winning. So yeah, that's the challenge. If you think that this might work, hit me up in the comment section under this stream or any other stream. It's a standing offer, of course, and let's talk about it. Just to give you a heads up, one of the harmonization strategies, one of the methods that, for example, Lydia McGrew is using is saying, okay, the autographs were inerrant, but there was an error in copying. So it might look like a contradiction, but the contradiction is only there because later scribes, who were of course not divinely inspired, made a mistake. They made a copying error. So that's one way how to harmonize it, right? And what I'm saying is that if you pick this strategy and every other strategy that Christian apologists are using, you'll be able to harmonize everything, right? So that's and also the reason why I don't want to focus on contradictions is because I think this is what Christian apologists have been trained for, and this is what they have been focusing their attention for, I would say, about 30 years now. And the reason for this is, I think, almost exclusively, or at least to a large degree, Bart Ehrman, because the way how Bart Ehrman argues, not so much in his popular books, but definitely very much in his debates, is he'll try to motivate Christian audiences in thinking that there are contradictions in the Bible in order to lower their confidence in the historical accuracy of the Bible, right? So what he basically says is, look, the Gospels are not historically reliable, they get at least some of the stuff wrong. And we can show that they get some of the stuff wrong because they affirm contradictory statements, right? And if you have a contradiction, well, at least one of the two contradictory statements must be false. That's just logically the case, right? So if there's a contradiction, then that means that at least half of that contradiction, what the contradiction is describing, didn't actually happen in history. So this is the way how he argues. And I think apologists, because he's the most popular guy, have spent a lot of time and wrote a lot of books basically dealing with this. So they've trained, they've memorized all of the harmonizations for all of the contradictions. So if you actually talk to a good Christian apologist and you bring one of these contradictions up, he'll be able to immediately recall a harmonization, right? So if you imagine the famous training scene in Rocky, this is what they're actually doing. You know, they are like lifting the Bibles and they are like running around, rehearsing these contradictions and training really hard, like sweat pouring down their faces. So yeah, they are really ready for it. But I just want to talk about something a little bit different, right? So just to quickly summarize the nativity stories we have in the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of Matthew. They're obviously different, and I think the best, most probable explanation, the best historical hypothesis for these differences is that these are two different authors just trying to basically reach the same goal, but probably because they didn't know about each other. It's not the case that when one of them wrote, he had a copy of the previous author's work in front of them. They just use different strategies, different ways how to reach the same outcome. So the resulting X are different. And the goal, the prize that they have in mind is basically getting Jesus to be born in Bethlehem, but also him simultaneously coming from Nazareth, right? And so they are both doing a different way, right? They're doing it a different way because neither one of them is actually based in history. They don't have any eyewitnesses or any reliable sources. They are just creating an original narrative. And because they don't know about each other, well, of course, they are coming up with two different stories, right? So in the Gospel of Matthew, Joseph and Mary actually start in Bethlehem. They go to Nazareth. Then they flee to Egypt. They are trying to go back to Bethlehem because that's where they came from, but they can't because after Herod dies, his son Archelaus is ruling where Bethlehem is. So instead of going back to Bethlehem, where they are from, they just decide to settle in Nazareth in Galilee instead. Why Nazareth in Galilee? Well, because Galilee is not actually under the rule of Archelaus, it's actually under a different guy. And in the Gospel of Luke, Joseph and Mary start in Nazareth, and they go to Bethlehem because of a census. Jesus is born there, and after Jesus is baptized and presented in the temple, not baptized, circumcised and presented in the temple, they just go home because there's no reason for them to stay in Bethlehem anymore, right? So they just go where they are from, and I think a lot of non-Christians, let's say, I even many Christians, right? Like when this is important for me to point out that what I'm going to be talking about tonight, there are actually Christians, even Christian scholars, who have no problem with anything that I'm saying. They would just completely accept it, right? So this isn't necessarily even a split between Christians and non-Christians, and this is not necessarily even a split between apologists and normal people, because there would be Christians who would affirm, for example, that Jesus was raised from the dead, and they would be able to give an apology for that belief, but they still wouldn't have any problem with what I'm saying, right? I think we all know one or two examples. You might have seen them on YouTube recently, and for every person like that, there are hundreds of people like that who just don't happen to be interviewed by famous YouTubers on YouTube, right? So if you are a Christian and you find what I'm saying compelling, you don't have to leave Christianity. Just go talk to those guys and they will tell you what, right? What's what. But it's sometimes the case that non-Christians recognize that obviously Jesus has to be born in Bethlehem in the Gospels because there's a prophecy about the Messiah being born in Bethlehem, or at least someone really important. So they recognize, and again, a lot of scholars recognize that as well, that the Gospels just depict Jesus being born in Bethlehem because it's in the Old Testament, so that must have happened, right? It's not like the Old Testament was wrong about where Jesus was born. Of course, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We know that from the Old Testament. That was the thinking of the Gospel authors. But I think some non-theists actually think that him coming from Nazareth is much more historically secure because and the rationale is, okay, if Jesus was actually born in Nazareth and he had to be born in Bethlehem, if the nativity was just completely invented, well, why not just say that Jesus just came from Bethlehem, right, from the Bethlehem area in Judea? Why have this convoluted story where he needs to essentially come from two different places at the same time? And by that logic, so they think, we can actually establish that Jesus really came from Nazareth and was probably born in Galilee, right? It's just that wouldn't work in the historical narrative. Therefore, there had to be this convoluted story, actually two different stories about how he was born in Bethlehem. But I don't actually agree with this because I think there are at least three reasons why Jesus is depicted as being born in Nazareth and coming from Galilee, even which are the case even if he actually wasn't born in Galilee at all, right? And I'm not necessarily saying that like conclusively proves or even proves that it's more probable than not that Jesus actually wasn't coming from Nazareth. He wasn't born in Galilee and wasn't primarily active in Galilee. I'm just saying that because these reasons that are still there are independent of what actually happened in history are there, we should lower our confidence that Jesus really was active primarily in Galilee and really came from Nazareth, right? What are the three reasons? When one of them is actually given by Matthew, the author of the Gospel, Matthew himself, he says that him coming from Nazareth fulfills a prophecy of him being called a Nazarene. Been pointed many times that no such prophecy can be found anywhere in the Old Testament. Some people actually try to connect it with a specific like religious order that existed in ancient Judaism, but that's a little bit difficult because the title isn't exactly the same. So there seems to be some disconnect. And of course, the people of that religious order were not members of that religious order in virtue of coming from Nazareth, right? So if this is the case, there seems to be some miscommunication, some misunderstanding between this idea and how the author of the Gospel of Matthew understands it. Or the author of the Gospel of Matthew actually realizes what's going on and he's changing the content of the prophecy deliberately. The second possibility is that there just was a text which was considered prophetic by the author of the Gospel of Matthew, which gave this prophecy, but the text was lost and we don't have it. So that would be the case of the author of the Gospel of Matthew calling to a prophecy in some piece of writing that we actually don't know anything about, right? And the third possibility is that there never really was any prophecy in any text, and the author of the Gospel of Matthew just made it up. He made up a prophecy about Jesus being called the Nazarene. That's also a possibility, right? But on the other two options, one possible reason for why the Gospel authors would be interested in depicting Jesus as coming from Nazareth or Galilee is because there was a prophecy about a Messiah or someone important that they want to depict Jesus as being coming from that area. The second reason why the Gospel authors would be interested in depicting Jesus being active in Galilee, that is independent from him actually being active there or coming from there, is of course Isaiah 9, verses 1 to 7, where it's talking about the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of nations. And it says how a child will be born to us, a son to us. It says authority will rest on his shoulders, and it will grow continually, and there shall be an endless peace at the throne of on the throne of David and his kingdom, and he will establish and uphold it, and these kinds of things, right? So seems to be like that could be that might be an interest to depict Jesus as basically being a fulfillment of that specific passage. And of course, there's a third reason why the gospel authors would be interested in Jesus being primarily active in Galilee or coming from Galilee, which might be independent from history. And this is something that I definitely want to talk about more in the future. And that's the idea that the Gospels, particularly the Gospel of Mark, which is, of course, as everyone knows, the oldest Gospels, right? You wouldn't just assert Matthean priority, is the narrative is actually modeled after the narrative of Elijah and Elisha in the book of Kings, right? So the things that Jesus and other characters, for example, John the Baptist, do can be explained as the author of the Gospel of Mark, essentially using it as a literary blueprint and performing a mimesis on that. And one of the things that is like a piece of evidence for mimesis is that movement of Jesus around the larger like Palestinian area seems to be, or it can be interpreted as mimesis of how Elisha and Elijah move in the book of Kings. So these are like three independent reasons why I think Jesus, historical Jesus, actually coming from Galilee, might not be as like super probable as people might think, right? So it's not the case that because we have this convoluted story where Jesus needs to be coming from two places, well, one of those places must be where he actually historically came from, and the other place must be just because of prophecy, right? So that's the basic idea. Just really quickly, what are some historical problems with nativity? Let's just pick one: the census, right? So, of course, in the Gospel of Matthew, the story of Jesus's birth takes place when Herod the Great was still ruling his realm in Judea, in Palestine. But in the Gospel of Luke, it says that Caesar Augustus organized a worldwide or empire-wide census, and this was the first census during the governorship of Quirinius, right? But the problem is that, well, if on the hypothesis that there was a census during Herod's life, right, which needs to be the case because in the Gospel of Matthew, Herod is still alive when Jesus is born. The problem is that Roman censuses only counted people in the Roman Empire, and more specifically, they only counted Roman citizens, right? So the three censuses that Caesar Augustus organized, I think it's like 27 BC, 8 BC, and I think 14 AD. Those three censuses would just be counting Romans. And if you, for example, read Res Gestae, which is a biography of Caesar Augustus, supposedly written by himself, which is like a piece of propaganda that was actually put on a tablet, usually a bronze tablet, in various places in the Roman Empire, which just gives an account of his own life in the first person. So we have many different versions of it because some of those tablets were actually excavated, and we of course have it also from manuscript evidence that actually tells us about the censuses that he organized, and it even tells us the specific number of people that were counted. He probably tells that because that was literary convention. If we look at how Roman historians reported censuses, when they do, they not only say there was a census, they actually give you the number of people that were counted, and those people were almost always only Roman citizens, right? So unless you want to say that Joseph was a Roman citizen, he wouldn't be counted. You might want to bite a bullet and say that Joseph was a Roman citizen. Why not, right? If that's what it takes to defend the nativity as a historical fact, I guess be my guest, But the thing is, of course, that Herod's realm at the time wasn't a part of the Roman Empire. It was a different country. Sure, it was a client kingdom, but there would be no census conducted there, right? There definitely wouldn't be a census for taxation purposes because, yes, Herod would collect revenue essentially from his people, and he would even be paying Romans a tribute, but the tribute would be paid in a fixed sum, and it would be up to Herod to essentially extract that money from his people. However, right, so Caesar Augustus would not be interested in running a census in Herod's own kingdom. He would just want Herod to regularly give him the due tribute in like a lump sum of gold, let's say, or money equivalent, monetary equivalent. And you know how these like petty kings, let's say, these client kings, and in general, like kingdoms around the Roman Empire, how they extracted revenue from their own subjects, from their population. Usually it wasn't through taxation. They, for example, collected toll from using roads and bridges. They, for example, collected tariffs on goods that were transported through ports and just generally through their territory. They, for example, rented mining of precious metals and these kinds of things, right? So yeah, just if you imagine there's a census in the US, that doesn't mean that there would also be a census in like US occupied Iraq, for example, even though, you know, Iraq, you know, there are like US soldiers there. You can say it's a client state because, you know, Romans authorities have something, US authorities have something to say about how Iraqis are governed. Just because there's a census in the US, you don't start counting Iraqis. There's no reason for it, right? That's a very rough analogy. Obviously, it doesn't work completely, but that's just the basic idea. Okay, what might be some different possible solution? You can just bite the bullet and say, okay, Herod died, and 10 years later, there was a census under Quirinius, right? So you might say that, okay, I'm willing to ditch the historical reliability of the Gospel of Matthew. That's false because, you know, there wouldn't be an census under Herod, but maybe there was a census under Quirinius, right? Several problems again. First of all, at the time after the death of Herod, his realm was partitioned among his children, and they each got, among his sons, and they each got a different piece. And it just happens to be the case that Bethlehem and Nazareth were in two different countries. So one was in Galilee, one was in Judea, and they were ruled by different authorities, right? Galilee was ruled by Herod Antipas, of course, and the reason why there was a census in Judea is because Romans actually decided to depose Archelaus, one of Herod's son, because they didn't like how he's ruling the territory as he was allotted, and they decided to make it a part of the Roman Empire directly. So instead of it being a petty kingdom, a client state, they just decided to make it a part of Roman province of Syria. So they just sent the governor of Syria at the time to conduct a census. So, and again, only people who are actually living in Bethlehem, in Judea, would be counted in that census. So if there's a census in the US, people in Canada are not counted because it's a different, right? And there are, of course, problems that are the case in, you know, regardless, right? Regardless of which date for the census you pick, either under Herod or under Quirinius. Of course, there is the famous problem of people being required to go to a location where their ancestors live, right? So it says that it actually gives the explicit reason, or what's the reason why Joseph had to go from Nazareth to Galilee to Bethlehem in the Gospel of Luke. It's not because he owned property there, right? It's not because he had relatives there. It's specifically because that's where his ancestor David came from. That was like 1,000 years ago, right? So again, if there's a census in Germany, that doesn't mean that Americans with German heritage, whose like descendants, whose ancestors lived in Germany in like 11th century, right, need to go to Germany to be counted in a German census. That's not how it works, right? And we actually know that people were counted where they live. So we actually know that people were not required to go to a location where the descendants lived like 1,000 years ago, right? We know that from primary sources. So let's just take a look at it. Yeah, we have this. So this is a an official document about a census being conducted in Egypt. So in Egypt, there was a similar situation, right? So in I think 31 BCE, um, Caesar Augustus very famously defeats Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium. And they go back to Egypt, and next year in 30 BCE, they commit suicide. And until then, independent country of Egypt, under the Ptolemies, becomes a Roman province. And of course, because it's a newly acquired territory, just like Judea was after deposing of Archelaus, Romans need to tax it, and then they continue to tax it regularly. So there were uh, provincial censuses in Egypt. And because Egypt is such a great location for preserving historical documents, because of its very dry climate, that's like a very suitable for preservation of papyrus, for example. We have this specific papyrus that's an official document informing the people in Egypt that there's going to be a census. And it says, Gaius Fabius Maximus, the prefect of Egypt, declares, the census by household having begun, it is essential that all those who are away from their nomos, until I think they're going all the way back. I think to to the old Egypt, like ancient Egyptian empire, like in the first couple of dynasties, was partitioned into districts that later Greeks called nomos in singular, right? So people who are away from their districts, let's say, be summoned to return to their own homes so that they may perform the customary business of registration and apply themselves to the cultivation which concerns them. So what is it talking about, right? So there's going to be a census. Let's say this was a census in the US. Let's say there was a guy who lived in New York, but during the time of the census, he just happened to be in San Francisco. Well, this document would be telling him, look, there's going to be a census, so we need to leave San Francisco. I need to come back to New York where you live so that we can actually count you there, right? Because if you are not in New York where you live, well, then people are not going to know that you're supposed to be there, that you live there, and we won't count you, right? So again, this is just telling you, no, if there's a census, people need to stay exactly where they live. They shouldn't go somewhere. They definitely shouldn't go to a different country, right? So again, the logic breaks down, and you might think, for example, okay, well, what if Joseph and Mary actually lived in Bethlehem, but they just happened to be away in Nazareth when the census was called, right? Wouldn't under this kind of organization, wouldn't they be required to actually leave Nazareth and return to Bethlehem where they live? Okay, sneaky, very clever. I like that idea. And by the way, this is just like what I made up as a possible out for an apologist. It's not like I've actually heard that from a Christian, because usually, sadly, the conversation never gets to like this level of sophistication. But hey, what do you do, right? They don't send their best apparently. But like if that was the case, right? If actually, Joseph of Mary lived in Bethlehem. They just happened to be away in Nazareth, and they would have to go back to Bethlehem because that's where they are from, right? That would make sense historically, but the problem is that, first of all, the reason that the author of the Gospel of Luke gives for them uh, going back to Bethlehem wouldn't actually be the case, right? Because it says they're coming to Bethlehem where their ancestor lived 1,000 years ago, but also they probably wouldn't have to stay in a barn because the inn was full, right? If they actually were from Bethlehem, they would just go where they live in Bethlehem, They would probably have a house there, So probably wouldn't have to stay in a barn. And the reason why, the author of the Gospel of Luke talks about them staying in a barn because the inn was full just clearly shows that they are somewhere where they don't live. They're actually traveling, and they are, elsewhere. They're not at home, because when you travel, you would normally stay in an inn. It was essentially an ancient equivalent of the hotel, where they would provide accommodation for people who are, traveling. They are on their way somewhere. So yeah, these are just some basic problems, right? And of course, like you can ask all kinds of questions, right? So just think about the Gospel of Matthew. So the Joseph, Mary and Jesus flee from Herod to Egypt, and they stay there until Herod dies. And if they leave Egypt, when they leave Egypt, where do they go? Well, if you are trying to harmonize it, they would have to go to Galilee, because that's where they are from, right? That would be absolutely no way for them to go, no reason for them to go back to Bethlehem, right? Because what would be the point, right? They no longer have any business in Bethlehem, so they would just naturally go home. But no, it seems to be the case that in the Gospel of Matthew, their intention is to go back to Bethlehem because, of course, in the cinematic universe of the Gospel of Matthew, that's where they originally lived, right? That's where they were from. They probably had a house there or some kind of property, and they only go to Nazareth because an angel warns them that Archelaus is just as bad as Herod, and they just decide to settle in Nazareth instead, and it's like a new location where they previously didn't live before. But in the Gospel of Luke, you just go take a trip to Bethlehem, to a different country. That's why they have to stay in an inn. And after Jesus is born, after he is circumcised, after he is presented in the temple, they just go home in Nazareth because, again, they have no business being in Bethlehem any longer. So yeah, this is the reason why, like every normal person, just obviously recognizes that these are just two different stories, and if you're trying to harmonize them, then the harmonization is very forced and it's very strained. And this is not just an atheist talking, because they are actually very conservative, evangelical Christian scholars. Again, conservative evangelical Christian scholars just love saying that every time, who kind of see it the same way. So let's let them explain what's what, right? What's actually going on. So Mike Lacona, the gift that keeps on giving, had a written debate with Bart Ehrman a while back. You will find the link to that debate in the description section under this stream. And in it, he wrote, Bart provides the example of the differences between the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke. In my opinion, those narratives include the most difficult and profound differences in the Gospels. As my friend Jonathan Pennington writes, despite our conflation of all these events at the annual church Christmas pageant, these stories do not in fact overlap at all. If Jesus did not appear as the named figure in both of these accounts, one would never suspect that they were stories about the same person. That's an excellent point. That's like, this is again, Jonathan Pennington is a Christian scholar. He's in fact a friend of Mike Lacona, so clearly Holy Spirit moved him, right? He's regenerated by God's grace. This isn't some atheist talking who still has scales on his eyes, right? This is not a reprobate, an unelected person, right? That God just created for damnation. These are fellow Christians who are, these are your brethren in faith, if you happen to be a Christian watching this, that are talking this way, right? And that's a really great point, actually. So if we had two different stories written in two different books, right? this is a Greek textbook, and this is Xenophon. But if we actually had like two different books, and the same story would be written in both of them, but we would just anonymize it, so we wouldn't like people reading it wouldn't know that the people there are supposed to be Jesus, John, and Mary, and they would just write it like read one, and read the other. There would be no way for them to conclude that it's actually even supposed to be about the same person, right? I think that's true. We could test it, even anonymize it, maybe take the names of the places out, or like change it for different names of places, and let's actually test it, right? Let's give it to different people, and let's see how many people will actually conclude that it's a story about the same guy. And I think if we actually did that experiment, most people would not conclude that it's a story supposed to be about the same guy. Why is that? I think that tells something about the way how people expect stories to be told, and that in turn tells something about how stories are told. When you are, telling stories about a guy, for example, about how he was born, it's usually not the case that two different authors would each tell just a half of the story with basically no overlap, right? And again, I'm going to talk a little more about it a little bit later. But Mike Lacuna, my favorite apologist, goes on to say, "Here I must acknowledge that I don't know what's going on and have no detailed explanations for these differences." Why is it the case? When I was doing prep for this video, I just Googled nativity harmonization, and there were dozens and dozens of pages of people providing very detailed harmonizations, verse by verse, with references to secondary literature, right? So on top of all of those harmonizations on Christian apologetics websites from Catholics and Baptists and Pentecostals and even Mormons, right? Because they, of course, also think that this is what actually happened on Earth in the past. So for every harmonization like that, there are many, many more that are actually contained in books that nobody reads anymore because this is the internet and that's how it works now, right? So why is it the case that Mike Lacona, who I'm sure, because he's an accomplished apologist, why is it the case that he doesn't know about what's going on there, right? And that he has no detailed explanation? Is it like, did he just never came across it in years and years of his apologetic studies? Well, no, of course he's aware of these harmonizations, but he realizes that they are shit, right? Because unlike other apologists, he strikes me as a really honest guy, and he actually, much more importantly, does have relevant education. I think Mike Lacona was actually trained to investigate what happened in the past, and he takes that seriously. He actually values historical method. He values the way how historians reason. And he thinks it's very important that the story of Jesus and what he accomplished basically stands under scrutiny of this historical method. So he doesn't ignore it. He doesn't want to bend it. And no, he actually thinks that, okay, if this is true, then it should, and if we apply this methodology, it should come out smelling like roses, right? So this is why he says, okay, I have no detailed explanation. I don't know what's going on. I think that's my reading of it, right? I think one can provide some plausible solutions. Of course, again, my challenge, show me a contradiction in any religion, and I will show you a possible solution, even plausible solution. But I admit they are speculative. In my research pertaining to the most basic compositional devices in ancient historical/biographical literature, I did not observe any devices that readily shed light on the differences between the infancy narratives. So, what is he saying here? Okay, so Mike Lacona spent years, apparently, answering the question, why are there differences in the Gospels? And he assumes that Gospels were written in the genre of Greco-Roman historical biography, the fool he is. And he thinks that he identified like a list of specific rigid compositional devices that ancient authors were taught and that they were then employed. And he thinks that he can find specific examples of these compositional devices being used in various historical writings, for example, the biographies of Plutarch, and that's what what explains differences in the Gospels, right? So it's not that, for example, the Gospels authors are lying; they are just being Greco-Roman historians deploying a specific set of well-defined literary compositional devices. Where does he get the list of the compositional devices? Mostly, he gets that from uh, ancient works on rhetorics that talk about what is appropriate for an author of a speech or a written text to do, right? So I think his analysis is flawed, to be honest, because I don't think in the ancient world there really was this toolkit of well-defined specific rhetorical devices, and I don't think that when Plutarch wrote, he was thinking, he was like consciously aware, and he thought, okay, I'm going to use this specific compositional device that I was like taught this is the thing by some like teacher, right? I think the textbooks actually create like their own taxonomy, their own typology of these devices. I think probably different textbooks did it differently. So it wasn't a thing, right? It wasn't like today in school curricula where you are taught like these very specific skills, very specific educational units that you are supposed to master, right? This is not like geometry when you are taught like specific ways, or not even, like English 101 or something like that, where a textbook would give you a basic structure of what you are taught, right? Or what you are supposed to be taught. I think this was much more fluid in the ancient world, right? So even though these rhetorical textbooks like give one outline, I think what Plutarch, for example, did when he wrote is a little bit different. There might be some similarities, but I don't think this was actually so rigidly structured. And what he's basically saying is, okay, like I'm assuming that there was really this toolbox of literary compositional devices with like finely well-defined tools in the toolbox. And when I just look at the infancy narratives, it seems that they are not product of application of any other tools, any of the tools in the tool. So that's why he's lost, right? Like his research of compositional devices doesn't actually solve it because this doesn't look like a product of any compositional device. And my answer to that is, well, no shit, Sherlock, right? That's because your the way how you're thinking about these compositional devices is probably flawed. But that's just a minor point. Then he goes on to say, however, even though, as I say, I don't know what's going on here to cause the differences, let's just speculate for the moment. And I absolutely love it. Let's speculate, shall we? Because really, when you are doing research in history, that's what you are doing a lot of the times, right? You have some data sets, you have some pieces of data, and you need to basically make up a hypothesis. You have to make up a story about what happened in history that we can't like prove because we don't have a time machine. We can't send a camera back in time, right? So we just have to make up a story. We just have to speculate, and then the different historians make up different stories, and then we employ various explanatory virtues and vices on those stories, and we just pick the best one, and based how well they perform on these explanatory virtues and vices, we assign them some level of confidence, some level of epistemic credence. So in some cases, we say, okay, we don't really know what happened. Could be this, could be that, don't know. In some cases, we say, okay, we think this probably happened. So let's just put it in a textbook. Let's just put it in a piece of secondary literature, a study. Let's put it in a school textbook. We're just going to add a caveat that this might not actually be what happened, right? We might say something like, it's reported that this is how this Caesar died, how this like Roman emperor died, but maybe it went differently. In some cases, we think we are so sure that we can just actually write positive descriptive statements about what happened in the past, like, in the late Bronze Age, in the period of the Second Palaces, Crete was under Greek rule. Maybe it wasn't, right? And you can, of course, provide alternative explanations for the various pieces of evidence suggesting that it was. But we think that the hypothesis that this is what actually happened in history, it's so probable that every textbook is going to just assert that as a fact, right? It would talk about it the same way as how we would talk about what you did last week, which is also something that happened in the past, right? So let's just speculate. Let's speculate for the moment and consider the following scenario. Matthew and Luke both agree that a Jewish virgin named Mary, who was engaged to a Jewish man named Joseph, gave birth in Bethlehem. The early Christians all knew this much. However, little else was remembered about this event. Huh. Little else was remembered about this event, right? When were the Gospels written exactly? Who were the authors? Are you telling me that at the time when the Gospels were written by the people who wrote them, little was remembered already? Surely there were still people who could tell the story, right? Like even if you think that all the people who were personally present during the birth of Jesus were dead, well, surely they talked about it to their friends, to their relatives, and those people were still around when the Gospels were written, right? Um, did Jesus talk about circumstances of his birth? Because, of course, him being all knowing, he would know exactly how it went down, right? Uh, how is it possible that on the dating of the Gospels and on the authorship of the Gospels that Mike Lacona subscribes to, little was remembered? That's really weird. It seems to me that Mike Lacuna might be suffering from some cognitive dissonance, that he wants to simultaneously affirm traditional dating and authorship for apologetic purposes, but here he's realizing he's being actually a good critical scholar. So he's talking the same way how critical New Testament scholars talk, who, of course, don't think that Jesus was actually born in Bethlehem, right? Funny how that works. Okay. So Matthew and Luke added details to their account to create a more interesting narrative of Jesus' birth, a type of midrash. I'm not saying this is what Matthew and Luke did. Okay, so okay, are you saying that or are you not saying that? I don't know what was going on with the infancy narratives. However, if this occurred, by the way, this is a written text, right? This was a written debate. I find it really interesting. Like I would find this kind of wording, this kind of phraseology, in an oral exchange, right? When you maybe say something in the heat of the moment, and then you have to kind of stop yourself, go back a little bit, and clarify it, right? But in the written text, where you can actually like write back what you wrote, read back what you wrote, that's really interesting. I'm not saying this is what would. However, if this occurred, we would have to take the matter of genre, midrash, into consideration and recognize that the historicity of the details outside of the story's core would be questionable, while the core itself would stand. After all, with such differences between the accounts in Matthew and Luke, one could reasonably argue that the core is attested by multiple independent sources. Cool. Can I do that with the resurrection accounts? Like I can perfectly grant you that, yeah, multiple different gospel authors all believed that Jesus was really raised from the dead. So when they wrote the resurrection accounts, they obviously depicted Jesus as being raised from the dead. They depicted as being raised from the dead bodily, because that's what they believed, right? Like when they imagined how the resurrection probably happened, of course they would imagine that Jesus' body would vanish from the location where it was placed, because it's not like a spiritual resurrection that leaves behind the body, right? So I can grant you that this is what those people believed. But could it be the case that they just added some details around this core because little was remembered, when the Gospels were actually written? Maybe Jesus really didn't eat a piece of fish. Maybe that was added. Maybe Thomas didn't really put fingers in his wounds. Maybe that's a detail that was added. But that's a digression, right? So this is what Mike Lacona says, and this is why he thinks that the nativity stories are such a problem. By the way, if you guys have questions, just feel free to type them in the chat, and I'll answer them. I think Greyback mentioned that he asked a question, but it got deleted. It's really weird. Like in the live chat, if you comment sometime before the stream actually goes live, the chat just resets, so your comments disappear. I guess it's a system that's built into YouTube so that people can't actually cheat and very cheaply get pine points. I think that's in YouTube terms of service. But yeah, like this is Mike Lacona saying it right? Again, right? Mike Lacona is being a good historian, and he realizes that no, like these cheap harmonizations just won't do it, because if we are good historians, we care about the historical method, and we care about the various criteria of what is a good explanation. The harmonizations are just not going to work, right? And also, the harmonizations are going to be implausible given what we know about history. Given, for example, some of the problems that I just reiterated, right? So even if you come up with a harmonization, the probability that it's actually what happened in history would be pretty low, just based on its low plausibility in general. So I just took one of the harmonizations from like a Catholic website. I don't know, like if you're a Protestant, do your own work. And I just outline it like this, right? So, of course, the harmonization provides it as a coherent story, which if you read it, I guess it makes sense. Like they kind of gloss over some of the details, right? Because that raises more questions, and we wouldn't want to do that, right? That would be 20 additional Hail Marys for doubting Jesus. But if you actually just like write the particular components out, this is how it looks like. And I'm saying that this is not how people tell stories. And like if these individual components of the story were a card in the deck, you would just have to like basically take two decks and you would have to merge them together. Do I have a deck here? I do. Okay. Yeah, this is a deck of cards. They are magic cards because they are the only cards that I have at home. Yeah, so like imagine every component of the story. For example, Gabriel visiting Mary was one card, right? So what you need to do when you harmonize these nativity stories is you have to take like two different decks of cards and you have to essentially smash them together so that the individual cards like slide into each other, and that's how you get one coherent story, right? But I mean, like, do people actually tell stories that way? I think they don't. And it would be actually really interesting to do some empirical research on it, just like look at stories of like describing the same events and see if you usually see this pattern, right? And more importantly, see if when you take those different sources together, they describe a coherent story, and the two stories are so different that like a normal person who doesn't know that this is going to be the same account of the same events about the same person would never suspect that it's actually the case, right? And I like tried to do that with Plutarch and Ariane, specifically with their biography of Alexander the Great, because they both wrote a biography. They wrote it roughly at the same time in the 2nd century. I think Plutarch died in like, well, after 119, and Ariane died in like 160. And what's important is that it seems that they are actually independent from each other, right? They use some of the same sources, like Ariane. Both would be actually using Ptolemy and Aristobulus. By the way, how do we know that they actually used the same sources, right? Well, because they tell us who their sources are. And why do they tell us? Well, because their sources were actually eyewitnesses. And they just say that they are eyewitnesses. So if you are an ancient historian and you are writing about events and you have eyewitness sources, well, then you just say so in the text, because why wouldn't you? That makes the story more credible, right? And Arian specifically is being very, very, well, he's being a good historian. He tells us which sources he's using, why, and he even tells us, okay, if the two sources disagree, this is what I do, right? So he even acknowledges that there might be problems with the sources, and he just informs us about his critical method. That's not what we find in the Gospel of Matthew, right? That's not what we find in the Gospel of Mark. So yeah, but the point is that they both wrote a biography of Alexander, roughly around the same time, and they are independent from each other, right? So I just took like major events in Alexander's life, and I just checked whether they are in the same source or in like both sources, or if they are just found in one. And yeah, like predictably, every single source, both sources actually, you mention all of them, right? And if these two biographies were more similar to the infancy narrative in Luke and Matthew, they would look maybe more like this, right? So they would have a core that would be mentioned in both. For example, which is arguably the most important, when Alexander, well, he didn't conquer Egypt. Egyptians just surrendered. So when he was in Egypt, he took a massive detour and killed like a large portion of his army through exposure to the elements to reach the oasis of Siva, which if you play Rome Total War, that's like the settlement west of Egypt. You have the three settlements in Egypt. I think it's Alexandria, Memphis, and one other one. And there is the like one to the north, which I think starts neutral as usual, taken either by Egypt or by Numidia, and that's called Siva. Well, the reason probably why it's in the game, it was like a really small town, but there was this famous oracle of Ammon, who was identified with Zeus in the Hellenistic times, and so Alexander basically traveled to that oracle, and the oracle, of course, confirmed to him that he really is the son of Zeus, that his mother actually had an intercourse with Zeus, or she was just impregnated a different way, not through sexual intercourse, because that would of course be immoral, and every good pagan would recognize it as such. But the point is that then you would basically have just like a half of the story in each, and it would just read very different. Like maybe some of the account would miss the conquest of Egypt completely, except for this one episode. One would just completely miss the events following the Battle of Gaugamel, all the way up until death of Darius, right? So you would have maybe Egypt, maybe Alexander leaving Egypt, and suddenly he would be in today's Afghanistan, and you wouldn't know what happened to Darius, and why is it the case that there isn't like half of the Persian Empire was still there, right? Even after the Battle of Gaugamel. But that's not really what we see. Like, is this a perfect analogy? Of course not, right? The obvious objection is that, okay, this is a complete biography, while in the infancy, when it comes to the infancy narratives in the Gospels, this is just like one part of the Gospels, right? That's not the whole thing. Fair enough. This is just for illustration. And are there details? Are there like stories that are only mentioned in one of the sources and not the other? Sure. Like some of the conspiracies, for example, some of the people that Alexander had execute because it seems they were plotting against him, that's only mentioned in one source or the other. But again, it's not the case that one account, that both accounts actually mention the conspiracy. It's just like one account narrates the conspiracy one way, the other account narrates it a different way, so that two different readers or the same reader who would read those two different accounts, not knowing that they're supposed to be about the same situation, the same people, but just not recognize it, right? Yeah. So that's basically it. Now I just want to have some fun, because as you all know, there is an ongoing dispute between Mike Lacona and Lydia McGrew, right? So Mike Lacona, we've all seen what he's like and what makes him tick. But of course, Lydia McGrew and by extension her husband, Timothy McGrew, are very, very different apologists, and they actually fancy harmonizations very much. They fancy them so much that they will basically grab whatever harmonization they can get. It's very, very rare. It happens sometimes that they recognize that some harmonization is not very good, but in 100% of the cases, those are only situations where they think they have a better harmonization, right? So Lydia McGrew is going to tell you, okay, this harmonization is garbage, but she will only tell you that in situation when she thinks she has a better one, right? So but they will take almost everything. Like again, Lydia McGrew was on record saying that one way how to harmonize some of the difficult apparent contradiction, is to say that okay, that was just scribal error, right? Well, I mean, if that's what it takes, then I think I'm pretty safe making the challenge to any theists. Give me any apparent contradiction in any religious text, and I will just harmonize it, no problem. So yeah, they have this ongoing dispute. I think it's really hilarious. Lydia McGrew has this blog post, which is amazing. It's called "What's Wrong with the World," and it's the blog post where she very famous. I think that's the blog post where she very famously wrote that she would be willing to die for Christianity. So maybe that's like one of the things that's wrong with the world, right? She was like criticizing Lacona for a long time. Then she actually wrote a book. I think I'm not sure what the title of the book is now. Okay, well, never mind. It's the last book that she wrote. Michael Lacona kind of responded by putting out a YouTube series of YouTube videos where she just like goes over some of the points that she makes. And now she's like responding to that. So that's really hilarious, right? And I think every Christian that watches that exchange doubts a little bit, because he's thinking, what's going on here, right? Like, why are these brothers in Christ clearly like harming the church by engaging in this debate? Shouldn't you both be combating atheists? And I think I'll show you why this is happening, right? Why is it actually the case that there is this dispute? So this is something that Lydia McGrew wrote. This is from one of her blog posts, and again, you will find a link to that in the description below. She says, and this is her essentially reviewing the written debate of Lacona with Bart Ehrman. She's specifically commenting on exactly the passage that I read to you previously from Lacona, where he's saying, okay, I don't know what's going on. Maybe this is Midrash. She says, next is Lacona's very, very confused use of the notion of core and details. As Lacona uses the word core in the passage, the core is what Matthew and Luke both agree on, the overlap between their stories. Now, that's a very odd concept of the core. Most of what would say, just read in Luke, that the shepherds are part of the core of his story. They're certainly very prominent in Luke, even though they are mentioned in Matthew. You can't identify the core and details of two accounts by simply by noting their overlap. That's actually a great point, right? Agree 100%. If Lacona is saying, okay, there was this set of information that early Christians agreed on, that they knew, because that's what actually happened. Like Jesus really was born of a virgin in Bethlehem. But then they added the details. Well, the thing is that in the actual accounts, what they added is pretty important, right? Like this is she's talking about the Gospel of Luke, but I think a much better case, much stronger case, could be made with the Gospel of Matthew. What's a detail that's not part of the core is the visitation of the Magi, the three visits that visit Jesus, right, and give him gold, among other things. Um, Slaughter of the innocent. That's a pretty important part of the story, right? And the flight to Egypt. That's a pretty important part of the story, right? That's not a detail. That's a core of the story. And of course, the point of Matthew's gospel is to draw the connection between Jesus and the Old Testament by saying how Jesus gave the full meaning various Old Testament passages. Is that a detail that author of the Gospel of Matthew invented? Was that this midrash, right? So she goes on to say, Lycaon's speculation would make everything outside of the core, that is, all the non-overlap, into mere details, which would be questionable. But that means an awful lot of material. The star, the Magi, the slaughter of the innocent. Okay, so she actually makes that point. The flight to Egypt, the angels, the shepherds, the major, the journey to Bethlehem, and the presentation in the temple. In other words, most of what we would call the Christmas story. And that actually gave me the idea for the thumbnail for this stream, where I just color coded the various components of the nativity scene, right? That most of you guys probably have in your homes. I sure do have one, as do my parents. Yeah, like if you actually take it out, if you color code the individual pieces and you start taking out these details that are questionable because they only appear in one sources, things that they were invented because it's midrash. Well, then you don't have anything less left, right? You don't even have the feeding box that Jesus is in. You just have Joseph, Mary, Jesus, and that's it. And of course, as you can see in the thumbnails, some of the details were actually added even later in apocryphal literature. For example, the oxen and the donkey only appears in Pseudo Matthew much later. So yeah, that's a great point, right? Like if you like Christmas, if you like your candles and Christmas tree and Christmas carols, and you like your nativity, well, you need to think about it. So she goes on to say, nor would anyone who was not using some kind of Old Testament scholar code talk normally call these details. They're obviously entire incidents. If it is how Lacona is willing to use the word details, it should lead us to great caution when one hears literary device theorist. This is her like tribal term for people like Lacona. Talk about gospel authors changing or inverting details rather than the core of the narrative. That's a really great point, right? So these are not just like, the things that J. Warner Wallace would tell you. Eyewitnesses disagree, like a color of a guy's shirt or a specific brand of a getaway car. No, these are actually entire incidents. Like these are substantial things, like events that happened in the story that motivate actions of the characters, like appearances, visitations of various angels, right? Most people would probably think that an angel appears only once in each story, one in Matthew and one in Joseph, but actually, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, there are just angels going up and down all the time, right? It's like Grand Central Station, telling them like all kinds of things, right? Like one angel, I think, tells him you need to go out of Egypt. You can leave Egypt now because Herod is dead. And almost immediately, an angel tells him, "Oh, but don't go that way. You have to go differently because Archelaus is just as bad, right?" Okay, she goes on to say, next, let's look at Lycona's very confused and confusing use of the term midrash. It's astounding that he makes not the slightest attempt to argue on independent grounds that Luke and Matthew, especially Luke, of all authors, is using midrash in the infancy narrative. So what's midrash? So midrash is a specific genre of ancient Jewish literature that has to do with expanding, most primarily on expanding, most importantly, expanding on previous texts, usually on scripture, most like typically on the Old Testament, right? What's today found in the Old Testament. She goes on to say, Luke grabs his use of midrash to mean largely invented, and then slaps it onto Luke, who is otherwise well known for his meticulous historical investigation. and nothing whatsoever in the way of independent indication, other than the differences between the stories themselves, which are almost entirely non-contradictory anyways, as I will discuss more below. Okay, so here she's essentially saying that what Slakona is doing is ad hoc, that he doesn't actually have any independent evidence that his explanation is correct, which I think fair enough. Lacona even recognizes it. He's saying, okay, this is speculation. I don't actually know that this is going on, right? What I take it to mean is that he doesn't have any independent evidence for it. So, I mean, still a valid criticism. It is ad hoc, technically speaking, and Lydia McGrew is perfectly fine calling him out on that because, like, that's an explanatory vice, right? But Lacona recognized that. But let's just keep this in mind. Let's just keep in mind that Lydia McGrew is criticizing Lacuna for invoking a historical explanation, historical hypothesis that is ad hoc. And let's see if it's going to come back and bite her. And I think this is going to be the last, last one. Yep. Okay, so this is the same text, and then she goes on to say, "This is highly irresponsible suggestion, since he goes on to solemnly tell that we would have to make the matter of genre midrash take the matter of genre into consideration. So wait, you just get to make up a genre designation out of whole cloth without any evidence, and then tell us that if this were true, we would have to take this made up idea into consideration when talking about the historicity of the passage. Why should anyone go along with such evidence free theorizing, right? So here, Lydia McGrew is sternly rebuking Mike Lacona for evidence free, what was it? Evidence free theorizing. Fair enough. Let's just keep this in mind, and let's look for consistency. She says it's actually rather depressing if one cares about this type of thing to see Lacona stating openly that even with all the many compositional devices he thinks he has found in ancient Greco-Roman literature, he couldn't find any labels to place onto the infancy narratives. So he just leaps instantly to grabbing a Jewish-sounding label to slap on term on them in a speculation, a label that he uses to mean making up a lot of stuff. This brings up a rather unsettling conclusion that all of this genre talk is not driven by objective scholarly indications of genre at all, but rather by the strained desire to find some sort of label that one can call a genre, thereby simultaneously suggesting fictionalization and also claiming that somehow it doesn't really matter. If a Greco-Roman label can't be found, a Hebrew one can be found. Okay, so here she's kind of talking about the same thing that I was talking about, right? So Michael Acona did his research on Greco-Roman literary compositional devices, and he thinks that there was like a well-defined set of specific devices. But the problem is that none of them actually work for resolving the apparent contradictions in the infancy narrative, right? So he's looking somewhere else, and he says, okay, well, if it's not these compositional devices, well, maybe it's a midrash, right? So he just like pulls a different thing, and that's how he solves the problem. And she's kind of saying, okay, not only is this completely evidence-free theorizing, it's actually a little bit concerning, right? Because if you can't find compositional devices, well, you will just take a different thing, right? And by the way, there was a hilarious exchange in a YouTube section, a comment section, under one of Pine Creek Duck's videos between Blake Giunta and me, where suddenly Lydia McGrew started commenting, right? And I should have pulled this up, but I'm just going to summarize, right? So I'm, of course, saying pretty much what Mike Lacona is saying about the infancy narratives here. I'm just saying it about the resurrection appearances, right? Like what I'm saying is that, yeah, the gospel authors all believe that Jesus really was raised, So when they were creating the narratives of what happened to his body and how he appeared to his disciples later, they just took that as granted. But because they didn't really have any sources, they just invented like a plausible scene based on what they already believed, what was their worldview, and based on the theological messages that they wanted to make, right? They wanted to communicate. So, for example, when um, Jesus eats a piece of fish, the reason why the detail is in the story is not because there were like 10 people watching him eat a piece of fish. It's because the author of the gospel wants his audience to understand that Jesus really did have a physical body even after his resurrection, in order to debunk essentially a bunch of different Christians who were running around saying that Jesus was just a ghost, that he didn't really have a physical body, that he was just had a spiritual body. So that's my explanation, right? And of course, Blake criticized me for that in the comment section. He criticized me, pointing out that what I'm doing is kind of similar to how Mike Lacona is using these compositional devices, right? And he says, okay, like these compositional devices. I think I brought up specifically the question of what was the first time when the disciples received the Holy Spirit, right? Because that's one of the obvious apparent contradictions in the Gospels. In the Gospel of John, they received the Holy Spirit by Jesus directly in the upper room when he appears to them the second time. I think I'm remembering it correctly. But in Acts, they actually received it under different circumstances, right? And when I had a debate with Blake Gunta, he actually came up with completely hilarious reason for why this is the case. He says that this was actually, I think, like a time compression or a change of chronology. Like the reason why the author of the Gospel of John, so he thinks that what actually happened in history is what's narrated in Acts, and the reason why the Gospel of John narrates it in different situation in like a different time is because, and get this, the author of the Gospel of John was running out of writing material, so like he didn't have enough papyrus left to narrate what actually happened. So in the limited space, he just narrated like a different story that didn't actually happen because that story would fit like the amount of papyrus that he had to work with, right? Okay, boomer. What do you even say to that, right? First of all, again, evidence-free theorizing, completely ad hoc, but also I bet you $100 that I myself can actually write a Greek sentence that is going to be consistent with what's in Acts, and it's going to be shorter than what's written in the Gospel of John. So again, this idea that you would have to deviate from history because you cannot possibly narrate the way how events supposedly took place in that space, like the way how it's narrated, or in the amount of space that's used for that in the Gospel of John, is really implausible. But anyway, right? So he actually suggested that this might be a possible literary device, that it's actually this change of chronology. And Lydia McGrew responded by saying, well, funny that you mentioned that, because to my knowledge, Mike Lacona never actually brings this up as an example of how these compositional devices were being used. But I find it really interesting that you were so quick to actually jump on that and identify it as a result of compositional device. And yeah, like I think Blake Yunta stopped commenting after that. I really got this like witch hunt vibe that okay, you must be a witch also, right? Find it really suspicious that you would say that. Um, yeah, so these are just like YouTube drama stories from the internet, right? And it's probably an unnecessary digression that I'm just going for too long about, but it's Christmas, so I think it's fits the season, right? But yeah, this is the idea that like she's really concerned that these people, once they got their eye on this idea that there are these compositional devices, it will just completely blow out of out of proportion, right? That they will just keep going with it. Yeah. And okay, and she goes on to say, uh, what it probably means is that either Luke was not aware of the flight to Egypt, meaning that he did not yet have Matthew's gospel at the time when he was writing his part of his own gospel, or that he chose to hew fairly closely to a written source for some reason, perhaps a political reason, left out the visit of the Magi and the events with which it's bound up, the slaughter of the innocents and the flight to Egypt. Okay, my spider sense is tingling. It's detecting some evidence-free theorizing. So, like just mere paragraphs ago, Lydia McGrew was actually criticizing Mike Lacona for using evidence-free theorizing. But then here we have probably, we have perhaps, and just seems to me like evidence-free theorizing. Like, where is your evidence that Luke was not aware of the flight to Egypt? What's your evidence that he had political reason for omitting it, right? Like, should I really go on and should I repeat back to you what you've just said about Mike Lacona, just substituting his the problem that he had with your own, right? Yeah, really, really interesting. And finally, I think this is the last point that I wanted to bring up. For far too long, this is in the conclusion, and this is really now she's really explaining why this is important. For far too long, Christian apologists have played the game of retreat and retrench, continually counting on multiple attestation to save them. This has given rise to ridiculous statements such as this: that it would not make any difference to the reliability of the Gospels if the infancy narratives were massively invented; that it wouldn't make any difference to the reliability, redefined, of the overlap between the infancy stories if they were otherwise invented; that we can do without John and still argue just as robustly that Jesus claimed to be God. And she's kind of going on about a different thing. She's criticizing, apart from Michael Lacona, she's also criticizing Craig Evans, who has no problem saying that, look, if we could go back in time, we wouldn't be able to find Jesus actually saying the highly exalted statements in the Gospel of John, like before Abraham was, I am, or if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He probably said something similar, but not this. That's just invented by the author of the Gospel of John, and that's why that's like the best explanation of why we don't find these statements also in the synoptics. And she's obviously criticizing him for the same reason, right? That like if you actually start buying into these ideas, it's a slippery slope. You will just keep going. This is really what's her problem. That we don't need the details of the resurrection narratives to defend the resurrection of Jesus, and so on and so forth. Okay, here, so this is the $1 million line. The real problem that she has is this. So we don't need the details of the resurrection narrative to defend the resurrection of Jesus. This is what's really the deal, right? If you actually open this kind of worms and you start making these claims that maybe the infancy narratives are largely invented and maybe the sayings of Jesus in the Gospel of John are largely largely invented, then you are basically opening yourself to the possibility, and you are definitely opening. You are creating an opening for this potential attack by a non-Christian, that maybe the details of the resurrection accounts are also invented. But then how do you defend the resurrection without these details being in, right? Because if you think that it's not the case, that Jesus had breakfast with 7 disciples on the shore of Sea of Galilee, but like multiple people saw him at the same time, and he like talked to them, he later taught them for 40 days, supposedly, right? If all of that stuff is out the window, then suddenly these naturalistic explanations for the resurrection and for the appearances start looking really, really probable, right? They would no longer be ruled out by these texts because what the text says doesn't actually happen. They wouldn't be undercut by, oh, Jesus was, it was a wholly modal, visual, auditory, and tactile vision. So it can't be a bereavement hallucination. It can't be pareidolia. It can't be hallucination, right? No, like if you take that out, what you're left with, Paul, the Damascus sort of experience is only found in Acts, right? Paul actually never describes how it looks like when he talks to Jesus. Is it just through interpretation of scriptures? He says he talks about a man, probably him, who was once caught up in the third heaven, but I think twice states that he doesn't know whether it was in the body or out of the body. What was that, a dream? Because early Christians thought that dreams are important, that like if you have a dream about an angel or a god appearing to you, that's actually legit. It didn't make a distinction between dreams being illusory and dreams actually being metaphysically true, So yeah, this is her real problem. And she goes on to say, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, literally devised theorists are playing these cards more and more aggressively, implying that, as a matter of fact, such quantities and types of material were really invented by the gospel authors. This is a game that should have been abandoned long ago. And I want to conclude by actually playing a clip of Lydia McGrew, because I think it perfectly summarizes what her deal is, why she is even interested in it, right?
Also, Tim and I had been tapped
stream.
back over 10.
Why she's really interested in this. I think it's very telling. And by the way, let me guys know if you can hear it, because I'm not 100% sure if this is going to be audible. So just type like 1 in the chat if you can hear it. So here we go.
View. Also, Tim and I had been tapped back over 10 years ago to write the article on the resurrection of Jesus for the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. And they were very generous. They gave us a lot of space there. And we realized that the reliability of the Gospels was really central, because one of the premises we were using there was that the witnesses claimed what we find in the gospel resurrection accounts, that like they could touch Jesus, they were talking with him. So these were not later embellishments. This is what the witnesses claimed. And then, we're lying. Well, why would they do that? How could they just be mistaken about something that detailed and so forth? And we realized that, if you accepted these views of the gospels.
Okay, so Mozilla is a massive piece of shit. I just use it because I don't have like bookmarks there, right? So you don't actually see what I'm browsing. But yeah, okay. So I think you've heard a little bit, and then it cut off. I will make sure to do better next time. But she's basically saying, let me summarize, right? Let me misrepresent her. That 10 years ago they were working on a chapter in the Blackwell's Companion of Natural Theology with Timothy McGrew. And their job, basically, which is, by the way, a completely hilarious article, and I will definitely make a stream just criticizing it, right? That's the famous article or chapter where they just counted the disciples that supposedly saw Jesus after he was raised. They completely arbitrarily assigned a 1 in 100 chance that we would have an account of these disciples seeing Jesus if it didn't actually happen, and they just multiply it, right? And they got this ridiculously low number, like 1 in 10 to the 44th power or something like that, right? So that's a story for another time. She's basically saying, okay, we were supposed to write this chapter, and we very quickly realized that in order to resurrection in order to be actually able to defend it, we need to make sure that we keep in the reliability, the historicity of the Gospels. Because if it's possible that some of the material in the Gospels is actually invented, well, that creates this opening, right? We can no longer say that the probability of the text being the way it is, if Jesus actually wasn't raised, is 1 in 100. The probability of that would be much, much higher because it would include the probability that it's invented. Like some of the features of the text are actually invented, that it didn't happen in history. If you really want to defend the resurrection of Jesus, you have to insist that if we could travel back in time, we would really find people who would truthfully say, okay, I believe that me and 6 other people had breakfast with Jesus. That's really difficult to explain on the hallucination hypothesis, right? Because like 7 different people don't all hallucinate same breakfast. But if the alternative explanation is that the gospel authors just invented this and it didn't really happen in history, well, there you go. Then the probability of the resurrection on that piece of evidence actually goes down because the probability of the competing explanation goes up, right? It's no longer 1 in 100. So I think this is one of the big reasons why she is so hung up on harmonization and why she will take almost any harmonization, no matter how implausible, no matter how ad hoc. You know, perhaps Luke wasn't aware of it. Maybe he left it out for a political reason, evidence-free theorizing, right? Because this is the ground that she cannot seize because she realizes if she actually gives up that ground, she knows what's coming. She realizes that this is a slippery slope. And I'm here to tell you, Lydia McGrew, you are correct. You identified the problem correctly. Your analysis is exactly 100% spot on. And this is what I am here to do. Like, I am your worst fear. I am doing exactly what you are afraid of. And I'm going to keep doing it, and I'm going to keep doing it better and better. And more people will reach and hear what I will reach more and more people. More and more people will hear what I have to say, right? So I'm the intellectual child, the spawn of Mike Lacona and his literary theorizing, literary devices. And I'm just here to take it to its logical conclusion and make Christians doubt the resurrection of Jesus. So yeah, that's it. This is why I like Mike Lacona. So yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. Let's go over some questions, if there are any. So if you have a question, just tag me in the chat, and I'll answer it. Okay. I think there was one question. David, 22585. Tertiary adjunct of Unimatrix 0. Have Christian apologists or scholars came up with anything resembling an explanation for why the census would have been conducted in such an absurd way? I don't want to be like uncharitable. It is very well possible that there are like harmonization of that, but in my experience, they don't address that issue. Like they talk about all kinds of other things, but they don't actually address the absurdity of someone having to return to the land of their ancestors. They, at best, they are trying to invent a different reason why Joseph would have to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. One very common harmonization is, or apologetics is saying, okay, he owned property there, so he would have to be there. I mean, this doesn't make any sense because, for example, the point of the census was for taxation of individuals, but taxation of land was done differently. So, like land being taxed had nothing to do with the census. So that wouldn't work on that basis, right? But again, you have like additional problems with that. If you are even saying that, well, then you are already conceding that the census didn't take place during the reign of Herod, right? Essentially. Mike Lacona is one of the least dishonest apologists. Yeah, I think so. I think he's really, really, well, great guy actually. And if you read his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, of course, A New Historical Approach, he has an amazing chapter called Confessions, where he goes very, very, very much in depth about his biases and how he deals with them, and the kind of emotional life and like intellectual life that he had when it comes to asking these questions. You won't find that kind of language being used by Frank Turek, or J. Warner Wallace. These guys are massively like uh, they are confidence junkies. They are certainty junkies. They're actually certainty dealers, right? So their audiences are certainty junkies. And they're just selling them the junk, right? They're selling them the stuff. Um, so they would never say, they would never talk about their doubt. They would never, for example, talk about how they have nights where they just couldn't sleep, and when their wife woke up and asked what happened, they said to their wife, "Okay, I think I will have to find a new job," because they were doubting the resurrection of Jesus so much. This is what Mike Lacon actually says. Um, I disagree with his opinions, right, on probably a lot of stuff, not just history, but you have to respect that. Okay. I'm a prophet and a seer. When you reached for a deck of cards, I knew it would be magic cards. Oh yeah, that well, that's why you're here for, right? References to Rome Total War and magic now. I'll have to maybe next Christmas I'll sing the opening theme to Adventure Time. Um, Lycon's little discussion with J. Warner Royce was amazing. Yeah, there is so many stuff that I want to talk about, but the problem is that Pine Creek is already covering it, right? Usually earlier than I can. But you are here for me reading primary sources and having very scholarly debate, scholarly discussion, almost giving a lecture, don't you know, about this. I hope none of my professors will ever find this channel. Uh, but by the way, how is the quality of the stream? Are there any technical problems, or is it good? Because here I'm seeing some gaps in concurrent viewers, so the Wi-Fi could be shit. But anyway, let's talk about something completely different, and it's going to be short this time because I just forgot that this is a thing, that's a segment that I'm supposed to do. So I just like 7:45 my time, so 15 minutes before we started, I just grabbed like the first thing that came to my mind, right? So it's just how this is just about how reading different sources can be hilarious, right? So this is one of the details that's being left in one source and included in another one, and it has to do with how uh, Romans got into the war with Pyrrhus. So as you, I'm sure you all know, in the 3rd century BCE, Rome was caught up with a war against the king of Epirus, Pyrrhus. Is also featured in Rome Total War. Like one of the historical battles is his siege of Sparta, which is completely ahistorical, by the way. Like that's a massive fail, right? Because they were basically forced to use the skins of the units that they had in the base game, which were nothing like how armies actually look back then. But anyway, of course, he's the most famous for coining the term Pyrrhic victory, or people later did, because he just won several times, but he had so many losses that it wasn't feasible for him to continue. And Romans, unlike other people, were just completely crazy. They were essentially the ancient equivalent of Taliban. Like every civilized nation in antiquity, when they lost a battle, they just sued for peace, and they wanted to sign a peace treaty for a given period of time. But the Romans decided that they will never surrender, and they will never sign a peace treaty if they are not the victor. So they will only sign a peace treaty with conquered enemies. And what's more important, and this is why the Roman Empire was a thing essentially, they had a rule saying that they will only sign a peace treaty for an indefinite amount of time. So what you will see in ancient sources very, very often is that there will be a peace treaty signed for 30 years, 50 years, usually like a short amount of time. But no, the Romans, when they conquered the city, they would just sign the peace treaty. They would make the city their ally, and the peace treaty would just go on indefinitely, meaning their new subjects had just two choices. Either they would honor the peace treaty and they would keep being a part of their empire, or they could just break the treaty. But then, of course, they would be breaking a treaty. So Romans would be completely justified in waging war on them again, right? It wasn't the case that a city once conquered by the Romans could just wait it out and gain its independence again. So this was a major difference. And these two passages essentially describe the circumstances of how Romans became involved with Pyrrhus. And basically, Romans had a feud with a city of Tarentos. It was a city located in southern Italy. I'm not sure if it's one of the cities in Rome Total War. I think it might be. So if you imagine, Italy as like a booth with a heel, where the booth ends, are these Greek city. It was a Greek city. I think it was founded by Sparta in like 8th century, something like that. But I might be wrong on that. So yeah, and Romans already had like disputes with these cities, and they eventually conquered all of them. But Tarentos, being very influential and being very rich and large city, they actually requested aid of Pyrrhus. And this was like an excuse for Pyrrhus to be involved. Because he was basically looking for an opening. He was trying to expand his sphere of influence to southern Italy. When it didn't work, he tried to expand it in Sicily for a while, then in Greece proper. Then eventually he died. But just look at how like two different historians talk about it. So Polybius, a much better source, by the way, he would be probably the best ancient historian that is preserved. Like if I had to make a list, he would be definitely like number one. Yeah, maybe with Thucydides and Tacitus, but yeah, I would probably put Polybius out up there for reasons that I could, have a different stream for, and we might have it. So Polybius says, sometime after the Tarentines, insulted the ambassadors of Rome, and in fear of the consequences, invaded and obtained the assistance of Pyrrhus. So fairly brief, right? Fairly straightforward. They just insulted the ambassadors. Fast forward a couple hundred years, I think about 200, and Appian was a Greek already writing during the Roman Principate, wrote a history of the Rome where he talks about the same event. And he says the Tarentines made difficulties about admitting the embassy, the Roman embassy, to their council at all. And when they had received them, jeered at them because they did not speak Greek perfectly. So those would be the Romans, and made fun of their togas because, of course, Greeks didn't wear togas, right? And of the purple stripe on them. But certain Philonides, a fellow found of jest and ribaldry, going up to Postumius, that was the Roman ambassador, the chief of the embassy, turned his back on him, drew up his dress, and polluted him with filth. Okay, so here we have a story about a guy shitting on a Roman ambassador, right? Didn't go over well. That should be the feature in Total War, by the way. You should definitely have the option when you receive an embassy, right? In the diplomatic mode, when someone is talking to you, you should definitely have the option to shit on them. It's the case kind of in Stellaris, which is, of course, a game by Paradox Interactive, where you can send insults. And so in some cases, they are really spicy. Not nearly as spicy as they could be, in my opinion. But yeah, they should definitely, or in Crusader Kings, that would be amazing, right? Maybe if you have the lunatic trait, there are some like really fun options. If your character is mad, he can do like some crazy things, and shitting on people definitely be I think. Maybe I'm wondering like why. Maybe that's tied to their togas being having like a purple stripe. Maybe they thought it's like dirty, you know. I don't know. So yeah, that's it. If you have any final thoughts or questions, this is your last chance. I will be streaming next week, which should be Wednesday the 30th. Normally, I'm streaming on Wednesdays, but this week it's different because I'm leaving, going to my family tomorrow, so that wouldn't work. But yeah, have you guys really Merry Christmas, and I'll see you next week.